let me contextualize this a little bit for people. One of the things that I do a fair amount of in my life is work around cross-cultural understanding, cultural competence, and the like. And fairly recently, I gave a presentation as part of a three-person panel presentation at the Atlantic Conference of Independent Schools. I did this for the Council on African Canadian Education that is in the process of developing a curriculum on cultural competence. And so this is the brief presentation that I gave. It's about 7 or 8 minutes long. Just some introductory comments on cultural competence that I gave as part of this panel conversation. I should say that this presentation, or at least a version of it, is on my website as well. So anyway, if people are interested in the topic. So we start with a definition. Cultural competence is probably a further step along the line of the continuum of what we used to call multiculturalism, cross-cultural understanding, cultural awareness, and the like. And it's really characterized by 3 or 4 things. Cultural competence involves both an awareness of our own cultural worldview, holding certain attitudes towards, positive attitudes towards the idea of cultural difference, and a knowledge of different cultural practices and worldviews. So there is a content piece of it. And finally, skills in cross-cultural work and communication. There are 3 main principles to cultural competence. The first is that to be culturally competent, we need to understand our own cultural situation, our own cultural heritage, and that cultural differences and similarities exist. Some people don't even get that. And so the first stage of cultural competence is to get that. The second is that we must understand the social and the cultural realities in which we work. So if part 1 is an awareness, part 2 is we need to know our particular circumstances, and I'll get into that in a minute. And finally, we need to understand the subtleties of communicating and working cross-culturally. So I have just a couple of slides on each one of those. In terms of understanding the very concept of cultural difference, I've been introduced to the work of this fellow by the name of Ed Nichols. And Ed Nichols is an industrial organizational psychologist, and he's been in this work for a long time. And essentially, he has developed a model for understanding, a philosophical model for understanding cultural worldviews. And that model is fairly complex, too complex for us to really get into today in this brief introduction. But essentially what he does is says that every people, every person, and all peoples have different ways of understanding the world, whether that's their value systems, their ways of knowing, and their basic ways of reasoning. People are different. And the next slide is quite busy, and it's not really necessary for us to understand it all, but if you can understand, just see that this slide, Ed Nichols' model, has given us an idea of the historical and ancient cultures, and then across the top of this slide, he has shown here the kind of categories for understanding cultural difference, whether it's in value systems or ways of knowing, and again, ways of processing information. Basically, the idea is people are different because people are different. Rupert Ross wrote a book a number of years ago on this topic relative to Native peoples in northern Ontario, and he called Dancing with a Ghost. Is anyone familiar with that text? Basically, what Ross's book does is it takes a look at some of the fundamental and philosophical aspects of Native culture so that we can understand that. And then, as a Crown attorney who's been a fly-in prosecutor in many of those Native communities, he talks about how those principles of Native culture interact with the criminal justice system. And so you get a very hands-on look at how those principles interact with formal systems. So it's a good way of understanding some of the concrete ways in which cultural difference shows up in daily operations. The second principle of being culturally competent is knowing the social, cultural, and historical context in which you're working. And one of the things that we need to accept is that in North America, our own context, the whole idea of diversity is fraught with difficulties. We need to accept that. We need to acknowledge that. So whether we're talking about the enslavement of African peoples, the attempted genocides of Native peoples, and the kinds of experiences, the social and political realities that people experienced who have come here in more recent waves of immigration, we have a loaded context in which to be doing cross-cultural work. So for example, when we think about the election in the United States fairly recently, what does it mean that a woman of European descent and a man of mixed African and European descent were contending for their party's nomination for candidate for president? That only takes on meaning, significant meaning, when you understand the social and historical reality of women in North America and the social and political reality of people of African descent in North America. I throw in here the class factor because it's an area where I'm quite passionate about that. But what this contest has meant to most people, for many people, might be different than what it means for people who are poor. So do poor women and do poor people of color see this in the same way as others? Just an interesting question, and adds to the complexity of the cultural context, the historical context that we're working in. And finally, there are principles of communicating across cultures. There's a whole science around cultural hermeneutics, if you will, which is about the subtleties of communicating cross-culturally, that talks about the need to develop a wide range and a wide variety of methods of both communicating verbally, non-verbally, and interpreting verbal and non-verbal responses. We won't get into that today. The bottom line is this comment from Elmer Holenstein, who says that before meaningless, unnatural, non-human, or immature behavior and corresponding values are attributed to someone of another culture, it's better to begin by doubting the adequacy of one's own judgment and knowledge. If we can hold that principle in our heads, we will automatically begin to increase our capacity to work and communicate cross-culturally. In other words, if someone's doing something that you don't understand, think first, well, maybe I'm stupid, maybe they're not crazy. Right? You know? So, I mean, if we can start from that principle, then we can be more open and accepting of other people. So, important thing to understand about cultural competence is those three principles. This is just a repeated slide. Understanding that cultural difference exists, understanding the social and cultural realities in which we work, and understanding the need and the subtleties of communicating across cultures. So those are, that's kind of cultural competence in a handbag. This is my contact information. I always say to the people that I speak to that by virtue of putting up with me for the last 10 minutes, you've purchased a lifetime subscription to me. And so if you email me or if you contact me, I will respond to your questions.